welcome everyone. Welcome to the second event of this year's Galena LitFest. I am Loras College. I'm the Adult Services Librarian at the Galena Public Library, and I've been doing these festivals for 11 years. So I want to thank you all for being here. Thank you. All of you being here means that I can keep doing them. I wouldn't be able to do them if nobody showed up. So I really appreciate each and every one of you. Before we get started, I just want to also thank the Friends of the Galena Public Library for providing the funding, as well as Carol Sullivan and Jan Levichek from the Galena Center for the Arts for co-hosting this with us. It's always really great to partner with the center that do such great work in the community. And I'm excited today to have Dr. Kevin Koch with us. I'm going to read a little bio and then we'll get started. So Dr. Koch is the Professor Emeritus of English from Loras College in Dubuque, Iowa. He's the author of 4 nature-based books blending personal narrative and informational writing to explore a sense of place. His books are The Thin Places, The Driftless Land, and Skiing at Midnight, as well as Midwest Bedrock, which we're here to discuss today. Books are for sale, and after the program, if you'd like to purchase one of his books, he'll be signing and out in the lobby there. So without further ado, I introduce Dr. Kevin Koch.
Thank you. Thanks all of you for coming this afternoon. As was mentioned, I just retired from Loras College. I was taught there for 42 years. I'm not sure how those years passed. I taught in the English department creative nonfiction classes and nature classes, and sometimes a combination of both. And so I thought it was appropriate for this book to dedicate it to those students from 42 years. So this is my dedication for my students. I've tried to teach you this one thing, that all the world is sacred. So as Luce mentioned, Midwest Bedrock is should be seen in view of the series of nature-based books that I've done. So I started with Skiing at Midnight, which is a focus on Dubuque County. Went a little broader with the Driftless Land, and then had the opportunity to teach in Ireland and return there. And even though I had spent about a year's worth of time all told in Ireland, still didn't make me feel like I was an expert about Ireland, but it did give me new eyes to come back and see my own area, the Driftless, with new eyes in a sense. So that was the topic of my next work, which was The Thin Places, a Celtic landscape from Ireland to the Driftless. But here we are with Midwest Bedrock, and so now focusing on the entire Midwest, the search for nature's soul in America's heartland. So I'm not going to go over each of these right now because I will be touching on each of them as I go through the presentation. But just visually right now, you can see how the book is set up. One chapter for each of the 12 Midwest states, at least 12 as the Census Bureau defines in Midwest, and kind of a focal point within each of the 12 states. So just, we'll start with Wisconsin and the Ice Age Trail. You'll see this map come up with each state that I talk about, and which was drawn by my daughter, by the way, and gives just a little visual sense of where the place is that I'm focusing on for that state. So my plan here is to take you through each of the 12 states, mostly through visual presentation and telling you about these, but with some short readings from some of them, probably not all of them, and then have a little Q&A at the end. I wrote the book over a period of pretty much over 3 summers. Not exactly in that way. I wrote the Minnesota chapter in Lake Itasca for a different work, and that became sort of the impetus to do this. And then I began writing the book during the summer of COVID. So what better way to do that than to start off with the Ice Age Trail, where I was camping with my wife, away from everybody else. But generally what we did is we do, in general, kind of like 2 states, 2 trips of 2 states for each of 3 summers, more or less. That was our pattern. And so, yeah, we're going to start with Wisconsin. Oh, the other thing is that I have a couple of states that I definitely want to read from, but this is the first audience participation part. Does anybody have any states that you want me to, and the excerpts are just like about 2 minutes long. So do you have any state that you want me to make sure I read from? It is, yeah. Yeah, in fact, I was at a coffee shop lately, and the waitress had on a T-shirt that says, "Not all of Kansas is boring." And I said, "Are you from the Flint Hills?" She said, "Yeah." Okay, so we got Kansas. Anybody else? Yes. Okay, Hocking Hills. And Mary, you said you were traveling in South Dakota. Yeah, I want to do that. Okay. And then if there's any others, you can just shout. Yes. Okay, absolutely. All right. And if I forget any of those, just say, hey, South Dakota. All right. So we're going to start with Wisconsin, the Ice Age Trail. And again, I'll talk through some of these, and then for some of them do a reading, and not all. But you can see on the map there, the Ice Age Trail in Wisconsin is one of 11 national scenic trails. So it essentially has the same status as the Appalachian Trail, the Pacific Northwest Trail. It's just not as well known, but it's really fantastic. It's 1,100 miles and called the Ice Age Trail because it follows the furthest most reach of the last glacier, the Wisconsin Imperial Glacier. So it begins up in sort of northwest Wisconsin, goes kind of east for a while, makes its way down south, and then swings back up to the Great Lakes, to Lake Michigan. Above it is glaciated lands, and below it is the Driftless Area, the unglaciated area. And what's really neat about it, so I decided on this area because as I was kind of picking out, what do I want to focus on for each state, I realized that I had been to a number of the spots along the Ice Age Trail in past times. Now, caveat here, we did not hike 1,100 miles, but I interviewed a few people that did. But we had quite a few places, along with places that we had already visited beforehand. So we start off far west at Interstate Park. It's a park kind of jointly managed between Wisconsin and Minnesota. It's a wonderful set of falls there. In fact, the lower left photo is a pothole, which is one of the formations found there. And so as that gorge was formed when an ice wall broke and a glacial lake drained, and water just, pummeling down, was probably a small gorge at the time. And these potholes were formed when a little pebble, or it could be even as big as a bowling ball or whatever, would just get caught in an eddy and swirl and swirl and swirl and work its way down and create this hole in the rock. And they are like all over the place. We move east on the east Wisconsin on the Ice Age Trail, and we get into the lake country, these beautiful marshy areas, and then some other fall or dells like at Wausau. On the far right is Rock of Gibraltar, or Gibraltar Rock, I mean. And in the back, you can see Wisconsin River. And we end at the Lake Michigan. And so it's 1,100 miles. Most of it is already complete. Some areas you still need to kind of walk on the roadside, but bit by bit they're getting it completed. Another interesting thing about it is that it's all maintained by volunteers. They have, I mean, there is a professional staff for the Ice Age Alliance, but it's a small staff. And mostly each section of the trail will have a friends group that maintains that part of the trail. So, so Wisconsin. Michigan, we traced the Great Lakes shoreline. We had been to Michigan Upper Peninsula once before this project when we went to the Porcupine Mountains. But this time we decided we would go up along the Lake Michigan shoreline on the east, stop at Sleeping Bear for a while, cross over at Mackinac, go up to Marquette, make our way across the state, go up in the Upper Peninsula, Keweenaw Peninsula to Copper Harbor. So, so here, top central is at Sleeping Bear National Dune. About 400 foot, nearly vertical, drop down into Lake Michigan sand dune bluff, formed at a time when Lake Michigan was lower and still had, the glacial age had ended, but so it was filled with a lot of sand that had been brought down by the glaciers, and winds just swept the sand up from west to east and piled it on these dunes. Great temptation to run down the sand dune. However, my wife pointed to signs that said, you can get down in about 5 minutes. It'll probably take you 4 hours to come back up. And thousands of dollars if they have to rescue you. Great rock formations at Marquette on the left side. On the right side is Black River Falls. Not the ones at what is it, Stevens Point area? Not that one, but up in the Upper Peninsula. Oh, that one's in Wisconsin, but these are very near Lake Superior. Copper Harbor, the tip, like I said, of that Upper Peninsula, and then the Upper Peninsula of the Upper Peninsula. And talking about landscapes, an interior landscape. So this was Copper area. And this particular mine had been closed down for about 100 years. And they had self-guided tours. Now, there was another one where you'd go with a guide, but we decided to do the self-guided one, which is really very strange. We're down about 110 feet below the surface, just by yourself. Some electric lights that look very much like, old style kerosene or whatever. A few little pieces of old equipment laying around here and there. And this little pool over to the left that looked very, I mean, if I'm near a pool, I'm usually going to want to take off my shoes and socks and jump in it. However, luckily we had viewed the informational video beforehand, which said that this was the top layer, layer of the mine that went down, 10 more layers, I think, probably close to 1,000 feet. And this was the shaft that went all the way down. All the other layers had filled with water, except for this layer, the top layer, which had natural drainage. So I guess it probably would not have been a good idea to jump in there. But I am going to read a quick little section from Michigan, back from Sleeping Bear National Dune. So Diane and I ended our bike ride on the Sleeping Bear Heritage Trail with an ice cream at the Shipwreck Cafe. The couples and young families sitting near us at the long counter didn't notice the grisly tale of Lake Michigan maritime disasters embossed in newspaper clippings beneath the counter's vinyl surface, hidden in plain sight. There was the 1912 Rouse Simmons that sank in a November storm while carrying 5,200 Christmas trees from the North Woods to Chicago. Weighed down by the trees, the ship foundered overnight as the storm brewed. 2 crewmen sent to check flashings were swept overboard. By the next afternoon, the ship sat low in the water as rescuers spotted it on the horizon. It disappeared before the rescuers could arrive. Within view of the Sleeping Bear Dune lay at least 16 more shipwrecks. Nearly 1,500 shipwrecks lay beneath Lake Michigan. The Great Lake winds that built up these dunes also give birth to the massive waves that take down ships. But we don't speak of that in the Shipwreck Cafe, where ice cream melts down the sides of our cones and drips onto the sunken tails. So my usual pattern, I forgot to mention, my usual mode of writing in this book, and really most of my work, is to combine informative writing with some narrative. So I always like to give a little bit of history, a little bit of geology, a little bit of the Native American past, whatever kind of seems to fit best to give a sense of place, but to couch it in the story of visiting there, sometimes going to a place with a park ranger, sometimes just my wife Diane and myself, or myself, etc. So that's kind of my usual pattern. So off into Ohio and the Hocking Hills. So you see in the sort of southeast of Ohio is the spot we're talking about. Beautiful area. One of my goals in the book is to portray places that don't fit the usual stereotype of Midwest. Whether it's stereotypes of the outsider from other parts of the country who think the Midwest is flat, and sometimes even to dispel the stereotypes of ourselves who might think that there could be nothing interesting to see in Iowa and Nebraska or Ohio as it is. And there just really are beautiful places in each of the states. So Ohio in the southern southeast section, Hocking Hills, beautiful place, a lot of rock cave or a lot of rock shelters, some caves, but really I think more of the rock shelters where you have a layer of sandstone that is worn to the back, but there's a lip on front of it, and oftentimes with the waterfall flowing over. These are often places that were overwintered by Native Americans. But again, just beautiful places. But it's also coal mining country, and or at the edge of coal mining country. So it's a lower left photo is a train bridge over what had been a railroad, now a bike trail, place called Moonville, which was a coal mining ghost town today. And the coal mining had been really very important industry in the area for decades and decades, from the late 1800s to about the mid 1900s. And then even really before, I think coal started losing its force and its power throughout the country, had been declining in that particular area. So a lot of ghost towns, but still dealing with the aftermath of the coal mining industry, especially the tailings can produce pollutants in the rivers. And so I interviewed an environmental biology professor from University of Ohio at Athens, not far from here. And she was involved in stream cleanup, and they've had some success stories there. At the same time, she said, they have had times when they would ask children to draw, the local stream, and they draw it with orange coloring, and it was pretty. So, but what I'm going to read about is this photo right up here, the top middle, sort of middle, kind of off to your right, which is one of the actual caves. And so I think you'll pick up the info from the reading. I will just point out that this is like one of the cave openings. There were 7 of these cave openings to this really large cave, and each one had kind of a different shape, and I thought of them as Gothic windows. I wish I owned windows like these. Light streams in from 7 Gothic openings, stretching almost from the floor to the 25-foot ceilings. The openings are irregular, curved, carved, twisted, and phantasmagoric. An ace of spades, a bowling pin, a goose taking flight, tongues of fire. From the outside, they can barely be seen, but from the inside, the 7 windows cast light spells across the otherwise darkened room. Diane and I are in the Rock House Cave in southern Ohio's Hocking Hills. This cave, a luxurious space running 200 feet long, 20 to 30 feet deep, and 25 feet tall, has been home to ancient peoples for thousands of years. The windows are water and wind-hewn openings to the cave interior. We and a few other families are merely passing through, of course. We use our phone flashlights to negotiate the deeper recesses and uneven floors where the light doesn't penetrate. We look out over the hills stretching beyond the windows. We bask in the coolness of the chamber and the perfect balance of light and earth and underworld. So that trip was combined with a trip to Indiana and the Hoosier National Forest, which is down in the southern portion. And again, most of our experience of going through Indiana is going through that top Interstate 80 level, flat, flat, and flat. And this is hilly, hilly, and hilly. This is an area that had been originally forested, and then late 1700s, early 1800s, forest was pretty much cleared for agriculture. It was a thin soil, excuse me, a thin soil, like I said, very hilly, and not particularly good erosion practices at the time. And within a few decades, several decades maybe, the land pretty much lost its agricultural qualities. And so then came the 1930s, the Great Depression. We have already, economic pressures, but we also have droughts. And so farmers are going bankrupt right and left. So the federal government began buying back farms from willing sellers to reestablish the forest, which then became the Hoosier National Forest. But what's kind of interesting is that you still get a feel for the communities that once were there and now are gone, because every once in a while you'd be driving in the middle of the forest and there'll just be this clearing with an old cemetery in the middle of it. So you know that this was once a farming community. It's also karst topography like we have here, and the bottom left is Marengo Cave. Really a neat place. But I'm going to read a little excerpt from the top right. It's a little hard to see in the photo, but this is a pathway through the woods that was a buffalo trace, a bison trace. And so you get the explanation from the reading. We were walking hand in hand when we noticed the buffalo trace that crossed our path. Then we stepped down into the gully on either side to check it out. Bison had long ago trampled down this pathway through the forest as they'd move each fall from summer grounds in Indiana and Ohio to winter grounds in Kentucky and vice versa in spring. Native Americans used the trace as a traveling path. The French used it in the 1700s to access their trading posts. British and then American army units marched along it. Settlers disembarking from boats on the Ohio River at the ford where the bison had crossed traveled the route in wagons heading west, adding wheel ruts to the hoof prints. The last bison was spotted on the trail in 1799. Most of the buffalo trace is gone, but here in the woods it runs beside us, crosses our path, and disappears again into the forest. I imagine the long line of dust that the bison must have kicked up with the weight of their hooves, a string that would have lingered long after their passing and tied together the horizons and everything beneath the dome of sky. So Kansas. Flint Hills and the National Tallgrass Prairie. So, again, who'd have think there are big hills in Kansas, right? But the eastern third of the state, there's a line of hills running from almost the top north of the state on down to the border and then a little bit into Oklahoma, called the Flint Hills. 80% of the remaining tallgrass prairie of the nation is in this region. And only a little bit is actually protected in preserve and refuge and stuff like that. Most of it is privately owned and utilized. Most of the area was not farmed, was never cultivated because the bedrock, the flint, is so near the surface, either right beneath the surface or even protruding from the surface, that it simply couldn't be plowed except kind of a little bit down in the valleys. You know? And so the bison were obviously were and are the best keepers of the prairie. Cattle kind of come in as number two, so long as they have big enough space and you move them around. And that is how the prairie is maintained. These are mostly owned by cattle ranchers who move cattle throughout their, have to be large land holdings. They do prescribed burns to keep the land, to keep the prairie healthy, etc. So, so here's, from Kansas. Red buffalo is what the Plains tribe called prairie fire. The name depicts the speed and fury of fire racing across the plains, but also signifies life returning to the dormant prairie in the spring of the year. We drove again to beat the heat on our last day in Kansas, this time on the Flint Hills Scenic Byway. We joked at about the state's utter practicality after spotting business signs like the tire store and recalling the literally named Council Grove City Water Supply Lake. But we also found colorful, humorous, and artistic touches. There was the Screw My Nuts automotive repair shop. And along the Flint Hills Byway, there was a quixotic outdoors art station where we found whimsical, metal-sculpted wild stallions and a wooden Stonehenge to which one could harness a giant magical horse. There was a tension here between the tamed and the wild, a sense that the prairie had to be conquered, but an equal sense that wildness gives the region life. And then we were back on the highway again. Heat shimmered off the treeless, rolling hills. Along a sweeping curve, and after a period of silence, Diane finally said, "I need some trees," invoking our wood's eye heritage along the upper Mississippi Valley. Yeah, I agreed, but added, somehow the vast open spaces are haunting and hallowed. And then we were silent again, racing across the prairie like the red buffalo. So Nebraska, again, if you're like me, most of your experience of Nebraska is driving across, again, Interstate 80. You can kind of see the the sandhills in the distance, but most of all, it's the corn. Well, a friend of mine that I used to teach with, Dana Livingston, taught at Loras with me for many years. Grew up in Nebraska, and then a few years ago moved back to Nebraska. And ever since he had moved back, he kept telling me, "You got to come visit and come to the Niobrara River." And so finally, when I got the book idea, well, let's go check out the Niobrara River. So Dana went with us for 3 days. We did some kayaking and some hiking the Niobrara River. This river stretches along the top tier of counties in the north of the state, eventually hooking up with the Missouri River. And it's right on the northern edge of the Sandhills. So the river itself is this drop dead gorgeous river, about a 250-foot canyon that it has down cut through. It's not a white water river, but it's a swift river. And so it continually sweeps down to the bedrock. So it's very clean and clear. It's not churning up any soil. You are going right over the bedrock. And again, with these canyon walls, and there are waterfalls coming in right and left. It bisects the Ogallala aquifer, and where it bisects, the water enters, the canyon, and water falls down. And so they're coming in right and left. This particular waterfall is on the river, not for kayaking. It is still down cutting. Dana grew up in this particular region, and he said, like, right about here on the photo, there's a bridge crossing over. And he said when he was a kid, the waterfall was on the other side of the bridge, and in a few decades has worked its way up the river. So it's still down cutting. And then the top right view off into the distance of the Sandhills. Just like this moonscape of sands that had blown in from the Rockies millions of years ago and grassed over. There's sort of like waves that grassed over in mid crest, and very, very bleak in one way and kind of haunting in other ways. And we took some trips way into the Sandhills, and just kept hoping the car didn't break down. Missouri, the Katy Trail. So in Missouri, the Katy Trail is the nation's largest bicycle hiking trail. It's a crushed limestone, sort of like the Heritage Trail or some of those around here. It runs for 260 some miles, I believe. Again, we didn't bike the whole thing, but interviewed a few people who did, and we biked quite a bit of it. It's on a railroad bed that has been defunct. It follows the Missouri River. And so the sort of image I had in my mind as I wrote this chapter was of layers. You have the geology of the river formation and of the limestone walls along the river. You have the Native American history that of peoples who lived along the river. You have the story of Lewis and Clark as they came up the Missouri, and there's a lot of spots along the trail where they stop, and there'll be a signboard and talk about have an excerpt from the journal from that location when they had spent a night overnight at this spot and what they wrote in their journals. You've got the coming of the railroad and the disappearance of the railroad, and then the coming of the trail, which had its own controversies. And this this part of the bike trail called the corkscrew was, in a sense, my symbol for those layers. So when you came, excuse me, if the river's here and Jefferson City's over here, about halfway across the state, you cross the Missouri River on a bridge that had a bike trail sort of separated from the highway. But so you're pretty far above the landscape, and so you've got to get down to the trail level. And so they have this corkscrew formation that just takes you down like this, right? And it occurred to me that was a little bit symbolic of the layers I was feeling at any one spot on the river, where you could sense the geology, the Native American history, the railroad, the Lewis and Clark story, et cetera, because you kept passing over the same spot, but just in a little different time and vantage point. So that kind of became my symbolic focus for the Katy Trail. On to Illinois. So I'm going to end up reading two pieces from Illinois because this one is actually a two-parter in a sense about Cahokia, but also the upper Mississippi shoreline. So Cahokia is, and I'll explain more what it is in a moment, but our location is right across the river from St. Louis. Okay. So if you're not familiar with Cahokia, it was a Native American metropolis, really, of about 20,000, some people say 30,000 people around the year 1100. Its location was important to, well, the features of the location were important as to why the city grew there. You've got the Mississippi River with Missouri coming in, Illinois just a little bit above that, not too far, some miles, but not too far from that, the Ohio River. So not only is this very fertile land from all the flooding called the American Bottom, but it's also a great intersection of riverine highways. And so this metropolis of 1,100 people grew up, and they were mound builders, came a little bit after the mound builders of this particular area, overlapped a little bit. So there are some mounds that we would recognize as conical mounds, but they were in particular known for platform mounds, which is like pyramids with the tops cut off. And these were not burial mounds, these were the conicals, but these were more ceremonial. So at the top there might be the shaman's residence and temple or things like that. Okay? And so 20,000 people at least by the year 1100. They colonized kind of up and down the river. Trempealeau, Wisconsin has some mounds built by people from Cahokia. Aztalan State Park, if you're familiar with that in Wisconsin, not far from Madison, has a mini one of these. This is called Monk's Mound. By 1300, archaeologists figure it was empty. Nobody really knows the reason why. Speculation, a lot of different speculations, but probably the main one is just too big for its resources at that time. You've got to go farther and farther out to cut wood. You've got to go farther and farther out to get food for everyone, et cetera, et cetera. And so eventually it breaks up and forms smaller communities. But like I said, this chapter was about Cahokia and the upper Mississippi shoreline. Oh, so I'm sorry, I was going to read that little thing about Cahokia. So one long ago spring, Diane and I, oops, that's the next one. Diane and I saved climbing Monk's Mound till the end of our visit. A stairway of 154 steps ascends the mound in two segments divided by a terrace halfway up. At the platform's top, the view stretches in all directions. Etched stone markers suggest what would have lain in sight in 1100 AD. To the north lay the stream that linked the city to the Mississippi River. To the east were dwelling huts, a stockade, and more mounds. To the west, Woodhenge in the Mississippi River. To the south, the Grand Plaza stretched out before the mound the length of a football field. Thousands of Cahokians might have gathered there to catch a glimpse of the high chief or shaman on a festival day. Today, of course, the St. Louis Gateway Arch is visible from the western horizon, on the western horizon, completed in 1965 to commemorate the American westward expansion. Whether a shaman with a vision 900 years into the future might have seen or sensed it back then, we'll never know. But the other thing about this chapter is I kind of talk about working our way down from Dubuque to Koch. We'd always want to go there, but things kept getting in the way. But we kept exploring more and more of the Illinois shoreline. So I have some places on the shoreline before we get to Koch. And here I'm going to shift out of this PowerPoint to just a little photo display from, where did that go? Okay, I'm going to have to do this manually. From Casper Bluff, which you may recognize. So these photos aren't closely related to the reading, except for the location, of course. One long ago spring, Diane and I found Casper Bluff, an 85-acre preserve located 5 miles southwest of Galena, among the bluffs of the Mississippi River. From our vantage point, 200 feet above the water, we looked down at hundreds of white gulls skimming below us in a slow, silent glide. The evenness of their flight was interrupted by a rolling breeze upon which the gulls alternately crested and then rode down. The flock looked like a shook white blanket flapping in slow time. Up on the bluff, the oak savanna also swelled and undulated from ravine to hilltop. Some of the swells were human-made, though. They were late woodland culture Native American burial mounds dating back to 600 AD. About 20 visible mounds graced Casper Bluff, including Illinois' sole remaining intact thunderbird effigy, whose wingspan stretches 100 feet. The Casper Bluff mounds are a remnant of the 600 mounds that once documented in Joe Davis County. Archaeologist Phil Millhouse points out that the area's Native American population, dating back 12,000 years ago, was growing in the early centuries of the first millennium AD. Settlements along rivers like the Mississippi were numerous. Mound building was important to the woodland culture communities. Mound artifacts, says Millhouse, dispel any notion that the woodland culture was primitive. Woodland peoples had artifacts that span the continent, Millhouse says, including Gulf Coast conch shells, shark's teeth, Lake Superior copper, obsidian from Yellowstone, and a host of other exotic cherts. In sacred landscapes, nature is sacramental, full of signs. On the spring morning of our first encounter with Casper Bluff, there were no road or city sounds, no whining of boats on the Mississippi. Above the river, hundreds of gulls skimmed along on a crest of wind, and on the bluff, the thunderbird effigy rode a crest of the oak savanna. So we'll go back to our states here. All right, on into North Dakota. So here we focus on an area called the Rendezvous region of the Northeast. And it's called that because it was a meeting place of Native Americans, French, and then Euro-American traders who would trade furs and then ship them on to the east and on into Europe. It is a flat land, probably fits most stereotypes of the Midwest, for about 60 miles west of the Red River. Then it hits this sharp embankment called the Pembina Escarpment, which was the wall of an old ancient glacial lake. And once you get on top of the escarpment, it kind of undulates. There's valleys as the Pembina River itself cuts through. There are interesting glacial lakes, et cetera, and a different kind of landscape that we explored, which was the interior of an abandoned missile silo. So as you're probably aware, North Dakota has kind of this line of missile silos, many of which are still operational, but This one was built in the 1970s, and two towns in which it's sort of in the middle of, and these two little towns just had this huge influx of military and construction people in the 1970s as they built these facilities. They were Minuteman missiles. It was fully operational for one day. And then Congress pulled the plug. Now, some could argue that the mere building of it brought Soviet Union and the United States to enter into treaties to reduce, et cetera, et cetera. But nevertheless, regardless, the effect was an absolute crumbling then of the infrastructure of this town and region. And so one of these had been purchased by an individual, and he gave tours of the interior. And it was like, so it had been abandoned for probably 40 years or whatever. But when we went down there, and it was like being in the inside of a crumbling dam. There was the walls were leaking, the humidifiers were running, the electric cords were still hanging down from the ceiling as if they had been evicted and had to get out in a day or whatever. And you thought, and these contained missiles. So, and then when the tour was over, we came up and onto the grounds, and he showed us the sheep that were keeping the lawn shorn on the grounds. And I thought that was quite a contrast between the missiles and the sheep. Was it North or South Dakota that somebody wanted me to read? Somebody said one of the Dakotas. South? Okay, all right, that's next. So Glacial Lakes region, you know, yeah, okay, so here we're looking at the Glacial Lakes area and also sort of the eastern corridor of South Dakota. So beautiful lakes in the upper northeast. Then when you get a little farther south, it's Palisades State Park and Sioux Falls. A lot of quartzite that the streams have broken through. And that's the little section I'm going to read from the upper right here. At Palisades State Park, the quartzite pokes through the landscape. The creek exposes and bisects 50-foot cliffs and towers of the pink angular rock. Creviced vertically, etched horizontally, occasionally leaning and topped by boxy blocks of stone, the Palisades look like large, precariously perched toy building blocks. Diane and I scrambled over the rocks like salamanders, clinging from stone to stone while climbing onto ledges and descending again to creekside. On the southern end of the park, a trail descends through a breach in the rock and empties onto a grassy shoreline path. Here, the quartzite begins to recede from the visible landscape. Upstream lies 50 feet of exposed cliffs and towers, then 20 and 10 feet. And here, right here, the quartzite disappears back into the ground. There is a thisness to creation, a point at which the immensity of nature comes down to one particular patch of earth. A universe of grasses and wildflowers proliferate in a remnant prairie at our feet. An ice chunk long ago toppled from a glacier's edge, hollowed out pond that we hike around today. To quartzite that elsewhere lies buried suddenly emerges at the surface right in front of our eyes. Nature's vastness suddenly whittles to one small waterfall where part of the Big Sioux River squeezes through a gap in the rock at the base of my feet. So the book really started at Lake Itasca before it knew it was a book. So the headwaters of the Mississippi River. There was a January term where I wasn't teaching, and some of you may recognize this guy here, Andy Augie, who taught with me in the English department. One particular January, neither of us were teaching a January term that particular year. And Andy's brother-in-law was the soon-to-retire park superintendent at Lake Itasca. So we decided we would go up and have a visit, and his brother-in-law graciously showed us around the lake, told us a lot about the park, about the beginnings of the Mississippi River. If you haven't been there, the headwaters is maybe from maybe the size of the floor space here, and about 18 inches deep. So you see people wading across the Mississippi River in summertime. So that was our first day there, and then our second day we were kind of on our own, so we decided we were going to snowshoe across the the lake. And so we get about 15 feet out there. There's like pickup trucks out there ice fishing, and we get about 15 feet out, and our snowshoes prints start filling up with water. Well, that's probably not good. But there's pickup trucks out there, right? So we try another spot, and again, they fill up with water. So we decided maybe we shouldn't do that. Andy posted something about it on Facebook, and our spouses and friends thought that was a wise decision. His children in particular thought it was hilarious. But then that night I read about it and found out that there are a lot of springs in the under the lake, and where those springs are, the ice can be compromised. So, anyway, but the chapter also talks a lot about the process of explorers trying to find the headwaters, and what does the headwaters even mean, to tell you the truth. And the Ojibwe helping Henry Schoolcraft to finally find the headwaters, but wondering what is the big deal about this, calling this one place the beginning of the river. All of these tributaries contribute to this great river. So it's all about all of those things. I'm going to end with Iowa and effigy mounds. When I was trying to decide what I was going to write about for Iowa, I have written about effigy mounds in each of my books, really, in the Driftless Land and in Thin Places. So I was looking around for other places, and of course there are other places I could have done, but I just couldn't not write about effigy mounds. But there was a new story to tell from the last time I had written about it. This particular trip, we were given a guided hike by David Barlin Lyles, who was now a park ranger there, but at that time, or before that, had been an investigator for the Park Service. And what he was investigating was the stealing of the theft of Native American remains from effigy mounds. So up until about the 1970s, archaeologists still routinely dug into mounds and graves and removed the remains and put them in museums. I remember seeing them at effigy mounds and other places, I think in Dubuque, et cetera, et cetera. By the 1990s, that was no longer acceptable. And in fact, law had been passed that any human remains that museums might have needed to be repatriated to the tribes. The park superintendent at the time simply did not want to do that. They were removed from display. They were taken down into the basement, and he falsified some documents to make it look like he was just removing old materials like dehumidifiers or things like that. And what he did was put the remains of, I believe, 40 individuals into garbage bags, into boxes, then which he put in his garage and left there. He retired, but stayed in the area. And 25 years later, and I don't know why it took quite so long, but eventually the Ho-Chunk tribe calls up and says, you know, it's really time for these remains, the old ones, they said, to be returned to us. And the new staff was very sympathetic to the request, but there's nothing there and there's no documentation. So David Barlin Lyles becomes a person who eventually traces them back to this former superintendent's garage. It's quite a story. It's one of the largest sites of Native American mounds in the country. Kind of its big feature is what's called the marching bears, where there's about 10 bears. They're not all here, but are marching along a river bluff. There are 2 raptors over on this side, on south side, that are like leading them, and another one that's sort of gathering them into line. One of the things I always find interesting about these mounds is that the soil is not from the bluff top, it's from the river bottom. If all you want to do is build a mound, whether it's burial or ceremonial, the easiest thing to do is take soil from here and put it here, right? But a lot of the soil in these mounds is from 450 feet below in the river. And again, there's no written record, but it's certainly a sense that that the river is sacred. One last thing, and then I'll read the short excerpt and then open for questions. But they also just recently discovered, or at least the Park Service recently discovered, the Ho-Chunk said, well, we knew this all along, is that the heart location of each of the animals aligns with Big Dipper on the fall and spring equinox. It's like if you took the Big Dipper and transposed them onto the ground, you'd get the marching bears. So, last one here. Effigy Mounds National Monument is a sacred jewel of Iowa's driftless region, but the sacred goes on forever in this mystical landscape. The eagle effigy near the rear of the marching bears is poised to swoop out over the Mississippi River. From there, no doubt, it will glide past the exposed bluffs at Pikes Peak across from the mouth of the Wisconsin River. It will fly inland along the sweet-flowing Dunning Spring in Decorah. It will ride the updrafts along the upper Iowa River and then bank a turn over the cornfields that wrap around the contoured hills. In a couple of wing flaps, it will circle over the mines of Spain in Dubuque, where this morning's autumn sunrise is lighting up the red, orange, and brown foliage of the river, or on the river bluff at the graves of Julian Dubuque and Chief Piastre. I've seen the eagle there. I've seen its white head and tail gliding above my kayak in summer, perched high in the shoreline trees. I've seen it perched on the edge of river ice in winter, waiting for an errant bass to surface. And I know that the eagle returns each night, or when it's ready, or when it's called to its sacred place in the soil at Effigy Mounds. So thank you. So.